Mr. Maligam, Justice Sujata Manohar, Ms. Bharucha, Mr. Mehta, distinguished members of the audience. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be delivering the Nani A. Palkhivala Memorial Lecture. He was a great citizen of India, as was just pointed out, an absolutely remarkable individual who contributed to our country in many important ways in the field of economics, in the field of law, and his views in particular of the importance of secularism, of the importance of markets being able to function, are today actually a more urgent reminder than ever before. I grew up in a family of lawyers, so for me in particular, Palkhivala was a revered name as I was growing up in Calcutta. We know of his achievements as a lawyer and contributions in many ways to the country. Remember the sports stadium that would fill up every year after the budget when he would speak. But we have to remember also what he stressed, talking about his own father. He pointed out that most importantly what my father taught me was, he taught me, and I'm quoting, he taught me compassion and kindness for the less privileged as more important than anything else. That sums up Nani Palkhivala. I've said before, I love coming to Mumbai. I love the city, its cosmopolitan nature, the thriving culture in the city. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be here in Mumbai. This is going to be a serious lecture. People in India usually get alarmed when you say a serious lecture, because serious lecture is treated as a boring lecture. There's a little bit of a risk of that, because I'm going to do two things, as Mr. Maligam already mentioned in my correspondence earlier. I am going to talk about corruption and the control of corruption, some of my own experience in India, and also some of the ideas that have come to us from the huge literature. But I also want to do something else. I want to take you a bit deep into the discipline of law and economics, the interface between the two. You know, ever since this, probably United States gets the credit for the start of the discipline, the serious interface between law and economics, with the Sherman Act in 1890, which is an antitrust legislation, pro-competition legislation, but it's become a huge field. And I think done right, the discipline of law and economics can contribute to a country's development, so it's important. But there are flaws in the discipline, the way it should be done. I want to give you a bit of a glimpse of that, using a little bit of what is modern game theory. A glimpse of that I want to give you. So it's in two parts, effectively, that I'm going to give you the lecture. When I mention game theory, people usually think of something very complicated, but you have to remember, one problem with economists, and I belong to the clan, is that they tend to enjoy making things difficult for the sake of making things difficult. Simplicity and clarity is something that we should cherish and go for. Thank you very much. Yeah, a second one will be needed eventually. Yeah, thank you. And a third one, so that's very good. Yeah, and I can assure you I don't think I'll reach a fourth one. So there's a beautiful story which illustrates the power of simple thinking rather than jumping straight away to complications and mathematics. This is an alleged trip by Sherlock Holmes with Watson, going from one small town in Britain to some rural area. While going there, it's become night. They are feeling sleepy, so Sherlock Holmes says, Watson, let us pitch a tent and go off to sleep. And tomorrow morning we will go ahead again. So the two of them pitch a tent and they go off to sleep. In the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes nudges Watson and wakes him up and says, Watson, open your eyes, look at the sky, and tell me what you can deduce. So Watson looks at the sky. You know, in London, because of the smog, you don't see stars, and the sky is just full of stars. So Watson says that I never knew that there are so many stars. So the fact that there are so many stars, from that I can deduce that there must be many planetary systems. The fact that there are many planetary systems, from that I can deduce that there must be some more planets like the Earth elsewhere. From the fact that there are planets like the Earth elsewhere, I deduce that there must be life in outer space. By then, Sherlock Holmes is extremely impatient. He says, no, no, Watson, it's just that someone has stolen our tent. If you go off in a tangential direction, you very often miss the essence. And that's the way I will try to do. I will go into some difficult areas of law and economics, but I will show you just trying to bring clarity of thought is extremely important. You know, corruption is a dreadful problem. And to say that it facilitates markets and functioning, yes, there are some situations where it can do that. But on the whole, it is bad for the economy. It's morally degrading. And you can see correlations of countries that have managed to get rid of corruption. Get rid of is too strong. Diminish corruption, and their economic prosperity has increased. So in every way, this is something that we have to strive to minimize, to put an end to if that were possible, but anyway, go towards that target. People feel very often that corruption is endemic. And India, if you do look around, there's just so much corruption all around. There are some years when it's a little less, some years it's a little more, but really it's a blink of a difference. It's a huge amount of corruption that we live with. And it's very often treated as something that is endemic. It is an inherent part of society. There are some beautiful passages by Kautilya in Arthashastra about corruption. Somewhat negative passages, but still I must read out because he is probably the first thinker and analyst of corruption. So this is roughly 300 BC, and I'm quoting, "Just as it is impossible not to taste honey or the poison on the tip of the tongue, so it is impossible for a government servant not to eat up at least a part of the king's revenue," unquote. So it's a very negative view of this, and he goes on about this as to how hard it is to catch corruption, and he's explaining that with this. "Just as fish moving underwater cannot possibly be found out as either drinking water or not drinking water, so servants employed in government work cannot be found out while taking money for themselves or not taking money. So they can take money is what he's stressing. Now, he's a remarkable thinker. He did point out, by the way, since we were talking about secularism, very early 300 BC, how religion can be used to delude the masses and make them do things which are actually not in their own interest. But you can hype up religion to do that. So it's a remarkable thinker. At the same time, I want to stress that it is not the case that we have to live with corruption, that it is endemic, it is impossible to catch. Corruption can be diminished vastly, and there is evidence of that. There are developed countries today in the world where if you go back to the early 19th century, the examples are corruption was very high. Late 18th century, early 19th century, United Kingdom, Sweden, its corruption is rampant. In Sweden, there was a term called the sportler. The sportler is somewhere in between a tip and a bribe. And in that Sweden of the sort of end 18th century, early 19th century, it was just rampant that for everything that you want to get the government to do, you have to provide a sportler. But over a relatively short period, 80 years, 100 years, corruption began going down in Sweden, and today Sweden is treated as the third least corrupt country. These estimates are always, you have to take with a pinch of salt, but with negligible amount of corruption. United Kingdom was like that. Corruption has gone down over a 100-year period or 150 years period. Corruption has gone down dramatically in the United Kingdom. Do you have to wait for 100 years? The answer is actually maybe not. There are examples of countries where corruption has gone down over a couple of decades. Singapore was a corrupt country, no longer. Singapore stands in Transparency International's chart of countries, very high up there, with an index of 85. I should explain this index. This index is freedom from corruption as perceived. So 100 means completely free of corruption, 0 means just completely rampant corruption. Needless to say, there is no country at 100 and there's no country at 0. Singapore is at 85, and Singapore is today ahead of United Kingdom in terms of corruption, lack of corruption. Hong Kong is today ranked, and I've got the figure over here, not ranked, sorry, gets a score of 77, and Hong Kong is ahead of United States in terms of freedom from corruption. And these were countries which basically 40, 50 years ago were very corrupt countries. So for a relatively short period, they have moved up there. And just in case you're curious, the world's least corrupt countries are Denmark and New Zealand, who tie with a score of 90. India is at a score of 40, pretty corrupt country. There are other countries in the vicinity. China has a very similar figure to India. Brazil has a very similar figure to India. So it's there. India is with these countries where we do not want to be, and nor should those countries want to be where they are. So this is an example, these numbers remind you that it is possible. It is possible to do it, but I also want to straight away say something which I will stress later on. Part of it is to do with economic incentives, doing that right economic policy, how laws are drafted. But a part of corruption is also in the human mindset. You don't even think of doing certain things in some societies. In other societies, you think of doing that. Take, for instance, pinching other people's wallets. Most people, a huge, huge majority, maybe 99%, don't even think of pinching other people's wallets. It's not as if they do cost-benefit analysis and decide it's not worth pinching other people's pockets, their wallets. They just don't even consider that. The number of things we do in life where it runs on complete trust among friends, India is quite remarkable. Anonymous trust in India is very low, but trust among close friends is very high. You can depend on them totally, and there you do not worry about the profit motive and what my friend will do to me. You know that the friend will not let you down. So there are a variety of ways where the human mindset matters, and there is recent research on that, and I'm going to come to some of that. Let me straight away go into some practical problems of corruption before I go into the analytics. First of all, in countries where corruption is pervasive, all around, India is an example of that, Brazil is an example of that, whole lot of emerging economies are examples of that. China is an example of that. What do you do and how do you handle this? First of all, we have to appreciate that when corruption is endemic and all over, you have to be careful about one thing. You can't use a ham-handed instrument to put an end to corruption, because corruption resides with a lot of legitimate activity. So if you try to put an end to corruption by stopping all activities of a certain kind, you will probably put an end to corruption, but you will bring the economy to a crashing halt. I'll give you an example. When I was in government, people would come and say that about black money being parked internationally, that why don't we investigate everyone's bank account abroad? The point is, India today is a modern society. Indians have bank accounts abroad, the ones who are doing business with different countries, traveling back and forth, and a lot of it is legitimate banking. If you unleash bureaucracy on that everyone is suspect, you're going to bring normal business to a halt. So you have to be surgical in terms of, we have to remember, in terms of corruption control. You have to be surgical, you have to decide that you pinpointed attacks. The way you think in terms of medicine, the reason why surgery for malignancy is such a difficult surgery is you don't clear out the whole area, because you know that there are healthy tissues you can't damage. So you need a lot of research, lot of targeting, so you go for exactly the tissues you want to remove without damaging the healthy tissues. With bureaucracy, there is very often a risk that you'll go overboard and use a ham-handed instrument to clear the problem. I have been very critical of India's demonetization, and I will tell you that's an example of that, that bringing 86% of the value of currency that is in circulation to suddenly declare that illegal tender, and 4 hours for that notice, and then 2 months or a little bit more for people to change that money, 86% of the currency in valuation, is a complete disrespect of the market. There are some laws of the market which, if you jolt it in such a big way, the economy is going to slow down. And indeed, the economy has slowed down as a consequence of that, because it was not a targeted attack on corruption at all. My own calculation is about 3 percentage points of the economy slowdown is because of the demonetization. Let me explain, and here there is a tribute to the government I want to give. The reason why it's 3 percentage points is my calculation is, there are a couple of things in the international domain which have helped India in a very big way. Oil price coming down should have had our growth going up. Also, ease of doing business has improved in India, and the government does get tribute for that it has improved that. But with all these things, the growth would have been back up to where it used to be for a 3-year period from 2005 to 2008 at roughly 9.3, 9.4%. It is now down. It was the latest quarter is 6.3. Before that it was 5.7. So it has taken about a 3 percentage points of knock that has been given by this. The GST, I should mention, since I am speaking on contemporary policy, I'm remarking, I think it's a very good policy. I'm glad it has been done. Its implementation has not been good at all. So one needs to work on that. It has to be improved vastly. It should be streamlined, but it is something that needed to be done. The demonetization did not need to be done at all. And there are very few countries with vibrant, good economies which have done this kind of demonetization. Now, so again, this is just that you have to target one problem in pervasive corruption, and this risk is bigger with China than with India, but again, it's worth mentioning. When corruption is pervasive, and in countries where laws are very complex, it's very easy to find some violation of the law by virtually everyone, minor or big. And indeed, since Fali Nariman was being mentioned, I was remembering the emergency days. Dreadful things were happening during the Indian emergency because the law was being used because everyone has violated some law. So anyone you don't like, you can go and pick that person out and find that some law has been violated. What happens in countries with pervasive corruption, even if the leader is very serious about bringing corruption down, it's a very natural political thing that you're not going to go after your friends to start with. I mean, you won't survive politically if you do that. So you begin to go after voices of dissent, those who are critical of what is being done, and gradually you silence those voices by bringing corruption charges over there. This for China actually is a very, very big risk. With Xi Jinping, I think he was serious, like many leaders, to bring down corruption. But gradually the corruption control becomes an instrument of silencing dissent. And this is again something that we have to be very careful with in countries with pervasive corruption. I like to believe that this risk is bigger for China than for India, because India is after all a functioning democracy. And so if there is a big silencing of dissent that goes on, the electorate begins to take note of that, as happened during the Indian emergency. So this is not such a big risk for India, but for countries with totalitarian control, this is indeed a very, very big risk. Let me come to more immediate matters where I have had some hands-on involvement. During my two particular topics I want to mention, during the time when I was Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government, one form of corruption to me is very painful, which is there in a big way, which was there when I was in government. I could see in the statistics the very big corruption on that. Food distribution. You know, I mean, to an Indian audience, I don't have to elaborate on that. The way India does it is the Indian government, through the Food Corporation of India, buys up a certain amount of food from the market. It's actually quite a bit that India buys up of rice and wheat. About, in fact, 25%, 1/4 of the goods are bought up. This is bought up not by using force. The government announces a high price, and farmers are given the option to sell to the government. The government collects it. Then this food is, two things are done with this food. One is a part of it is kept in storage for in case there is a shortage of food or a sudden inflation, you will release that. And there are, of course, tricky economic issues involved with that. I've been involved also, but I'm not going to get into that. But a second use of the food that is collected is for poor people, and the way we give it out is there are roughly 500,000 stores all over India, and the government hands out food below the market price to these stores and tells these store owners that poor people will come with their cards, below poverty line cards, and in contemporary India it will gradually become their Aadhaar identification. And to the poor people, you sell this food below market price, we are setting the price. It's now not very surprising that what many of these ration shops do, there will be a neighboring shop which is run by the brother, which is not a ration shop, that's a free market shop. The food that comes from the government below market price, you pass it on to the brother's shop, sell it at the full market price, take away their profit, and when poor people come to collect their food grain ration, you tell them that the food has not arrived. We have estimates. India is pretty good statistically, by the way. I mean, you can make other criticisms, but India's collection of data is reasonably good. We have data that roughly 45% of the food leaks out, does not reach the poor. The food that is collected for the poor does not reach the poor. And this is actually criminal because it is also a huge tax on India's fiscal numbers that happens because of this leakage. What do you do about this? To me, this is exactly where you have to bring economic analysis to bear on the problem. To try to do this entire operation by the government, going to the farmer, collecting the food, using government stores to hand over the food to the poor is not a good idea. A much better way to do the same thing is to hand over cash or food stamps to the poor and tell the poor that you will not be able to buy the food below market price. The price will be the market price. You can go into any store, buy it, but we are giving you cash. Use this cash to buy the food. What that will do immediately is ration shops are gone. This is happening through private traders supplying the food, selling the food, but the subsidy has been transferred to the poor, and the poor will go and buy the food at market price. Another benefit of this is when the poor go into the store under this system that I'm suggesting, they are going to go like anyone else because they are going to pay the market price. They've already received the cash, they will buy it at the market price. Like any policy intervention, this is not without its downsides. I mean, there are some downsides to it and risks associated with this. One of them, which has been very often pointed out, is many of the poor people, once you give them cash, they are not going to spend it on food. They will spend it on tobacco, they will spend it on alcohol, they will spend it on other things. My point is, even if that were to happen, I would rather have the poor household spend the money on other things than the ration shop owner spend the money on other things, who's not supposed to do so. Number two is there are lots of studies which show that you can actually improve on this by working out the modality of handing over the cash. There are some wonderful statistical studies from developing countries, India, Bangladesh, and very good control studies from Britain with a lot of statistics. When you give a subsidy to a household, if you hand it over to the woman rather than to the man, the expenditure is much more responsible. So this does deserve, I think, recognition. So you can do things and improve the nature of distribution. So don't try to do the whole thing through the government collecting the food, handing over, use the private traders along with the government giving the subsidies, and you will cut out a huge amount of the corruption will go out. So this was a suggestion that I would very often put on the table, and I'm hoping that these things take time in India, but something will happen. The other one that I want to mention, which got me very involved in the law and economics debate, and one of the reasons I've come back to the subject now in a deeper academic way, law and economics, was this particular experience. Soon after joining government, I was still very naive. If I had been in government long enough, I would never have got into this area. You know, I was being very troubled by harassment bribes. Harassment bribes are bribes that you're asked to pay for something that is legitimate. You've done your income tax returns, everything, then you're asked to pay a bribe before you're given a final clearance on that. And this is not a question of big or small things. You brought in a cargo from abroad, you've done your paperwork right, but you're asked to give a bribe to be able to release your cargo. I call these harassment bribes. And one of the things that I think there should be more people from outside government who should go into work in government is because the experience changes. When I lived in India as an ordinary citizen, a professor, I encountered harassment bribes often enough. Trying to get a driver's license, doing my tax papers, I would be harassed and asked for a bribe. Once I went into government, this was not happening at all. I mean, I would go to these places as the chief economic advisor, didn't face any of this. So I believe, and I'm being generous to a lot of the bureaucrats, if you've had your entire career in government, you forget that this is so rampant in India because you don't face this kind of a thing. Whereas if you go in from outside, you are very mindful. What should be done about this? Here I got involved a little bit in the law. And since this is the Palkhivala lecture, I want to explain this to you. In India, bribery of this kind is controlled by a law which is a 1988 law, which is called the Prevention of Corruption Act, 1988. The Prevention of Corruption Act, 1988 says that if there is bribery, an incident of bribery, and this is proved, then both the giver of the bribe and the taker of the bribe are equally liable to be punished. Section 12 of the law puts the responsibility, the crime, on the shoulders of both. There are a few exceptions I have to point out in case there are lawyers over here. Section 24 is a bit of an exception, but it's not allowed in practice. And there are judgments given which basically don't create room for exceptions. So according to the Indian law, the giving and taking of a bribe are equally punishable. To me, an antenna went up as an economic theorist that once you make the giving and taking of a bribe, especially for harassment bribes, whether it's pure harassment that you're being asked to pay a bribe, one problem arises. After the bribe has been paid, it is now in the interest of the bribe taker and the bribe giver to collude and hide the information, because their interests are the same after the act of bribery. If caught, both of them will be punished. One way to rupture that is to amend the law and say that for harassment bribes, giving a bribe is not a crime at all. It's a legal activity. But taking a bribe is a fully illegal activity. You can be punished doubly. If you make this the law, then the collusion between the giver and the taker will go, because after giving the bribe, you will be free to speak that I had to give a bribe, I was asked, because it's not an illegal activity. Once you rupture the collusion between the taker and the giver, the bribe taker will be much more hesitant to take the bribe in the first place, because the bribe taker will be aware that in the second period, this person is not going to collude with me, but will spill the beans. This is actually, I've just given you a verbal description of what is a Nash equilibrium. John Nash, the famous game theorist, it's that equilibrium idea being used in a very practical way. I got very excited by this. I wrote it up as a short paper and posted it on the Ministry of Finance website, that you should make giving of bribe legal, taking of bribe doubly illegal, and punish the person doubly. It was my naivety. If I had been in government for 2-3 years, I would have known that you don't do that. Furor broke out after that. There were questions being raised in the parliament. There were a member of parliament, I happen to remember the name, but I won't mention anymore. It's history now, who wrote to Dr. Manmohan Singh and said that I should be asked to leave government for putting such a immoral idea on the government's website. Saying bribery shouldn't be stopped, but the mechanism should be asymmetric, and people were objecting to that. There were articles that appeared, very critical articles in, I remember the Hindu, the Telegraph in Calcutta, attacking this as an immoral, dreadful idea. There were television discussions which took place, and one evening, this was for me very memorable, it was a weekend, my wife and I were there in Delhi, when a phone call came from a very popular television channel saying that, will you come on television and explain your idea and defend it? Now, I don't have to tell an Indian audience what television debates are like in India. It would be a wild shouting match on the screen. I'm actually quite comfortable with that. I don't get ruffled by that. So my first instinct was, I'll go on television and I'll explain that this is a moral idea. I'm not suggesting this out of any immorality, but out of morality, because I want corruption to end. But then I thought I was giving so much grief to the government, because the finance minister, that time Pranab Mukherjee, had got letters, Manmohan Singh had got letters, that I thought I will phone them and ask, should I defend my idea and explain, or try to bury it and put an end to it? I discovered, it was a weekend, that the finance minister, Pranab Mukherjee, was away in Vietnam at that time. So I phoned Dr. Singh's, Manmohan Singh's residence in the evening. Someone came on the line. I said, I have an important decision to take within the next half an hour. I will have to call back a television channel. I would like to take the Prime Minister's advice. So she said that I'll talk to the Prime Minister and see whether he can come on the line or not. So she put it down, but within 15 minutes my phone rang, and she said that the Prime Minister will talk to you. So I said, Dr. Singh, I'm getting a Prime Minister, I'm getting an invitation to be on a television debate about an idea of mine which you may or may not have seen. It is to do with, I was beginning to say, when he stopped me and he said that, Kaushik, actually I have read about your idea, and I should tell you straight away that I don't agree with it at all, your idea. Now, it was, of course, a bit disappointing to me. I was trying to explain to him on the phone what the idea was. He must have read newspaper reports, but on the phone, and the Prime Minister's busy, you can't really do that. So I kept quiet, but then he added, and which is to me very memorable, he said, though I disagree with it, the idea of an advisor is someone who brings ideas to the table. So you should feel free completely to talk about it and see if people buy into this idea or not. So you're completely welcome to talk, discuss, and promote your idea, because that's what you're supposed to do as an advisor. You know, there are very few emerging economies which give this kind of space to people to voice new ideas. And I know, partial to Dr. Singh for this, because I think it needs a level of courage to be able to say that, I disagree with you, I know you disagree with me, but please don't feel silenced by that. Still voice your opinion, let people hear what you are trying to say. So this is a very vivid memory, and I remember after that in a G20 meeting with members of other countries, I was talking about this experience, and they were all agreeing that outside of advanced economies, you don't have this kind of space for free speech and the floating of ideas, and this is something that we should cherish. I'm not saying you should accept this idea or accept that idea, but to have this space for discussion where India stood out in the world, India for an emerging economy, for this kind of space for ideas to be floated that India has had, makes us proud, and this is not something that we really want to abandon. So this idea was there. I was lucky that after that a few people spoke up. Very memorable for me, because Mr. Narayan Murthy spoke up very supportively. Then the international media picked up. The Economist wrote a very supportive article. Le Monde in Paris wrote an op-ed supporting the idea. Subsequently, there are researchers now. There are two of my friends, Gianca Spaniolo and Maria Berlin, who have discovered that in China in 1997, a corruption law was made asymmetric of this kind. The giver is not as punishable as the taker. So now they are collecting masses of data to see whether the corruption has a break in the 1997, so you catch a statistical pattern in the nature of corruption through that. So it's an exciting idea, and I think we should think about it, and I still feel that it is an idea that ought to be pursued. I want to give you one of the reasons why. So bringing ideas to law, just at passion, just determination and anger is not good enough. You know, you hear people very often very angry about corruption, and of course you have to be angry. But that anger has to be channeled into thinking, into analysis, before you can try to bring corruption to an end, because you don't want to make matters worse. And we have to remember that corruption has continued for a very long time. So it is something that is not easy. It can be removed, it can be ended, but it is not easy. We have to do thinking in terms of how exactly do you amend the law? How do you affect the incentives of individuals? Like the a food ration example that I gave, that is an example where the market incentives have to be respected when you devise a law and you try to put an end to corruption. So that is a very, very important exercise. But why is it that the discipline of law and economics has in some sense failed us? And I want to take you a little bit, just a short discourse into modern law and economics, and what is, I think, something that ought to be amended in the way we think of law and economics and done better. For this, it's a short introduction I'm going to give to law and economics, and I've distributed some papers which I'll refer to just in a moment. You know, when I used to live in Washington, I used to give 5 lectures, Introduction to Game Theory, which was open to everyone. And in my last year, I felt very, very honored and pleased that it would be an auditorium with people from government, executive directors of the International Monetary Fund, whole lot of students, of course, from the U.S. Treasury, who would come for this 5-lecture course on game theory. And I do believe if at some point Bombay invites me to do that, I'll come here and give a 5-lecture course for the corporate leaders and policymakers on the elements of game theory which can be conveyed very easily. So the Washington experience was a non-degree 5 lectures, and very often we give too much emphasis to degrees, so the non-degree is important enough to be able to do that short course. But I'm going to give you an even shorter course now, which is a 10-minute course on the law and economics. The discipline began in the 1960s, and there are 3 big names which got the discipline going. There was Guido Calabresi from Yale, and he's still around and active. He's just got a book that came out early this year. There was Gary Becker, the Chicago economist, a great economist, Nobel Prize winner. I have lots of disagreements with Gary Becker, but when I was at the World Bank and Gary Becker came to speak in my World Bank once a month lecture, I said this about Gary Becker, that lots of people identify themselves as anti-Beckerian. And I said that it is a remarkable tribute to a person if anti-you becomes a school of thought. So Gary Becker was someone who was a very powerful thinker, and people took different sides on that. He contributed to law and economics. And then there was Coase, Ronald Coase, who made a huge contribution. Here is my problem with, I got very interested in the law and economics through their work and through the American experience of antitrust legislation. Antitrust legislation in the US, as I said, it began in 1890 with the Sherman Act. Then there was the Clayton Act, 1914, Robinson-Patman Act, 1935. And you can see how these laws, how important these laws are. See, with these antitrust legislations to protect consumer rights, Americans understood after some time that if you stop firms from colluding, it is good for consumers. But when firms are selling to consumers abroad, you don't want to cramp their style, which is a dreadful form of nationalism. You want to allow them to collude if you're selling for people abroad. So in America, there is a law called the Webb-Pomerine Act, 1918, which says that if you are, however, producing the bulk of your good for international buyers, you can collude. It gives you that space, and now virtually all countries, All big rich countries have this provision. Japan allows collusion if it's for the international market. So law and economics is something which is used for good or for bad in a variety of ways, and it gets really triggered. This big literature on law and economics gets triggered from 1960s by these big works. My problem is the following, and I'll just give you a glimpse of this. Consider any law. Just pick a random example of a particular law. So let me take a new speed limit law, which says that if you drive your car at above, say, 80 kilometers per hour, there's going to be a fine that you'll have to pay. According to traditional law and economics, which comes down to us from Gary Becker, the reason why this influences behavior is the following. That before this law was there, suppose there's no speeding law. You're thinking of going from Bombay to Pune, and you're wondering how fast you will drive. You make some mental calculations that if you go very fast, there's a risk of a skid and an accident. You don't want that. You make this calculation and decide at what speed you will go. Now when a new law comes into existence, which says that you'll be fined if you're caught driving above 80 kilometers per hour or 100 kilometers per hour, your calculation will change because there's one more thing you'll take into account. There's a risk of a skid and an accident, but there's also a risk that a police car will stop me and I'll be fined a certain amount of money. So the probability of being caught multiplied by the fine that you will have to pay is another cost that will get into your head. This was Gary Becker's emphasis, and he says by controlling either the probability of catching a person or by changing the amount of fine, we can control human behavior and make them behave better. This is what was troubling me when I got involved in this literature, is in the end, the law is nothing but a few lines scribbled on a piece of paper. How change human behavior? The way the Chicago school answered this, I think they were making a mistake. They were treating the enforcers of the law, the police, the magistrate, the judge, as mechanical agents. That as soon as a new law comes in, they will go about enforcing it. But in reality, if you think of all individuals as part of the game of life, ordinary citizens, the police, the magistrate, the judge, the prime minister, the president, everyone is a part of the game of life. A new law is nothing but a few words inked on paper. At one level, the game of life should not change by just a few little ink spilt on paper. You should behave exactly the way you were behaving earlier, get the same returns earlier. Why is it that those words written down on paper called law begin to change human behavior? Or does it change at all? Of course, in emerging economies and even in rich countries, there are lots of examples of laws which collectively people look away from that. People don't enforce that law. I think in India there is a law, or used to be a law, that you can't have more than a certain number of bottles of alcohol at home. Most people are not aware of that. During the emergency, this was invoked. And some professors who were relatively liberal in the number of bottles they kept at home and critical of the emergency got picked up on the ground that they had too many bottles of whiskey at home. So there are lots of laws which are collectively overlooked, and it's also documented. This is true, of course, hugely in emerging economies, but also in rich countries. There are laws that are collectively overlooked. But why are some laws collectively overlooked and why are some laws followed? I think this we need to understand much better for the better implementation of the law. So on the ink on paper criticism comes the following, which is my response, that the ink on paper cannot change the game of life that we are playing. It cannot change the economy, the way it's functioning. The reward for doing the same actions must be the same, the payoffs that you get. But it can do something else, that ink on paper. It can change your expectation of other people's behavior. And other people's behavior changes because they expect your behavior to change. So ink on paper, few words on paper, can trigger my expectation. Like when there becomes a new law saying you can't drive above 100 kilometers per hour, when I drive above 100 kilometers per hour, above that speed, I believe that the police policeman is going to come chasing after me and stop me. And why will the policeman do that? Because the policeman believes that if people drive above 100 kilometers per hour and I don't stop them, then I won't get a promotion in my job from my senior. Why does the senior do that? In the end, it's nothing but our expectation of one another's behaviors. How these expectations can play a role, and very, very powerful role, determining human behavior, our beliefs about one another, has been stressed from the time of the philosopher David Hume to relatively contemporary ideas, including some law and economic legal theorists who have contributed to this. The element of understanding this is a concept of the focal point. The focal point was created by the economist Thomas Schelling, and it is a concept out of psychology, but a very powerful concept. I have distributed a sheet with you all, and you may want to just try this out. Take first of all that colorful picture of a map with a river, with a bridge, with some trees, grass growing, some houses, and a railway track. This is a game that Thomas Schelling had developed in his famous book, The Strategy of Conflict. Imagine the following thing. You and another paratrooper, the Indian Air Force, has dropped you in enemy territory, two of you. Each of you have in your pocket the map of the area where you've been dropped, and this is the map that is in your pocket. You've been dropped and you have to do the following. You have to meet up, the two of you have to meet up. If you meet up and get together, you will be able to destroy the enemy forces. If you do not manage to meet up, the enemies will kill you. That will be your end. And this is a game, a formal game, so this is how you play the game. You look at the map, study the map, and you know the other person has got a similar map. You choose some place in this terrain and you go and stand there. You can just choose one place and no looking far away. If both of you choose the same place, you will meet up and the enemy will be vanquished. If you choose different places to go and stand, you will not meet up, you will be vanquished. So look at this map and choose a place where you will go and stand. So this used to be given by Thomas Schelling, and I've actually done it subsequently with people. So all you know is that you've got this map in hand, you know another person has been dropped from your side, your Air Force, you want to meet with that person, you have to choose a place to go and stand, and you're choosing which spot is it where you will go and stand. There's no correct answer in this. This is just pure human psychology. It so happens that 6 out of 7 people, in most experiments done with this, go and stand at the bridge. We don't quite know why, we don't quite know how, but we know that it makes a difference. People have an ability to coordinate psychologically. Now, there is another game I'm going to give, and you've got a set of squares. First, look at the set of squares with nothing written on it. This is called the squares game. The squares game is a very easy game. You've got this board in front of you, and another player has a similar board in front. Both of you will have to choose a square. One of these. There are 16 squares over there. You choose one and the other person chooses one. If you choose the same square, you will get $100 each. If you choose different squares, you'll get nothing. Which square will you choose? It's virtually impossible to give an answer with a board like this. Which one will the other person choose? I don't know. So usually the way people play this game, it's going to be all over. I'll choose some square, someone else will choose another square. We won't get the money typically. But now I'm going to change I won't change the game, but I'll give you a slightly different board. You switch over to the next page where you have the same board with G written on one square. G is for a gold colored square. One square has a gold color, G. The game is exactly the same. The gold color plays no role in your reward. You choose a square, the other person chooses a square. If you choose the same square, you will get $100. If you choose different squares, you will get 0. Now with this new board, it's pretty clear what most people will do. Virtually everyone will choose that G square, and they will get $100. Both of them will choose, they'll manage to do it. Placing that symbol G influences human behavior, though in itself it does not increase your reward, decrease your reward, nothing. Just placing it somewhere influences human behavior. And we've seen this being used in practical, very, very practical areas. Airports in the olden days, you're planning to meet someone at the airport, you say, let's meet at 12 o'clock, you forget to fix a place. So you are wondering, where will my friend be now in Heathrow? Well, you know my friend is a nerdy friend who'll probably be at the W.H. Smith bookshop. You do some thinking and you go to one of those places. Heathrow Airport solved this problem with a very easy innovation. They put up a board somewhere, any place, which said meeting point. That's it. A meeting point sign is not forcing you to do anything, influences nothing in the game of life that you're playing. It's just a sign. But it triggers our expectations of one another's behavior. When I'm looking for my friend and we've forgotten where to meet, I'll go and stand below the meeting point sign. It improves societal coordination. These signs and symbols are called focal points in game theory. My point is, the law in the end is nothing but a creation of a focal point. It exchanges our expectations of one another's behavior. And it changes our expectations of one another's behavior in ways where you can get a better outcome to come about. For instance, with a speed limit sign, I worry that now when I drive faster, the police person will come chasing after me. And the police person worries that if I don't go chasing after a person driving fast, the magistrate may book me for not doing so. And the magistrate worries. Similarly, you get locked into this. Time is running out. I want to give you one practical example. And then this is the structure of analysis that I think should be used for going back to very practical problems. But how important this is was stressed in a work which to me is very important in my own intellectual life. This is during the Czechoslovakian oppressive days of East European totalitarianism. How is totalitarian power manifested? You know, David Hume, writing in 1858, had speculated that, you know, the dictators and tyrants are so powerful, it's not because they have bigger muscles and they'll come running after you. In the end, what can an individual do? It is because of ordinary human beings' beliefs about one another that one person's power becomes enormous and overwhelming because we begin to threaten one another. It's ordinary people's beliefs which does it. This, without referring to Hume, I don't even know whether he was familiar with Hume, Václav Havel, who later became president of Czechoslovakia, wrote a paper which everyone should read. It's plain English paper now in English. When he was in jail, as a dissident against the totalitarian government of Czechoslovakia. He was leading a movement trying to put an end to that. In 1979, this document had been smuggled out of Czechoslovakia, this paper written by Havel. For me, this is a very important document because in the early 1980s, I was visiting Oxford. And at a dinner at Oxford, seated next to me was this political philosopher, Stephen Lukes. Stephen Lukes asked me, he was an elderly person, I was starting out quite fresh. Stephen Lukes asked me what I was working on, and I told Stephen Lukes that I'm very interested in political power. What gives power? Stephen Lukes said, in that case, you should read the work by Václav Havel. And this is a work that has just been smuggled out of, a few years ago, smuggled out of a Czechoslovakian jail. And now I'm involved in the translation, he told me. And he gave me the fresh translated copy of Havel's document. I must describe this to you a little bit because it is the use of focal point that Havel is doing without using that language, because he is a political activist. Later on became a president, and president with a powerful moral voice. And I personally believe that moral voices are extremely important. You can't be in politics if you're devoid of morals. Morals play a role. And here's Václav Havel describing totalitarianism in this country. He talks about, he never mentions the country, by the way. He talks about this imaginary country in this essay where he calls it a post-totalitarian system. It's a dreadful dictatorship, and how does it run? It runs like this. He talks about a greengrocer. A greengrocer on the window of his store puts up a sign declaring loyalty to the dictatorship, to the dictatorial government. And Havel asks the question, is the greengrocer really so loyal that the greengrocer puts up a sign declaring his loyalty? And Havel reaches the conclusion, no. The greengrocer is not loyal at all. And he's clearly talking about his own country, so he knows. He says that the greengrocer puts up that sign because the greengrocer worries that if he does not put up that declaration of loyalty to the totalitarian government, then the party people, the Communist Party in this case, the party bosses will come and point fingers at him, call him disloyal, and harass him in small ways. He will not get the food rations on time, his children will not be able to go to the preferred school, the party bosses will harass him and call him disloyal. Then Havel goes on to ask, why will the party bosses do that? Is it because they are so loyal to the regime? And Havel answers no. They are also not loyal to the regime at all. They will do that because if a greengrocer is disloyal and they don't harass the greengrocer, they will be called disloyal. And it's that fear that locks them into this behavior. And Havel's theory is a very generous theory, and I actually sympathize with that. There are situations where in life, right from the tyrant at the top to ordinary people, you all get locked in. You don't know any way of stepping out of this because your mutual beliefs create an equilibrium and lock you into this. And there have been cases like this in not just in totalitarian countries. If you think of the McCarthy period in the United States, there was general harassment of people taking place on the ground that you're un-American. And the trouble was, if your friend is described as un-American, and if you get up and say that, no, I have no evidence, I know this person, he is not un-American, it'll be taken as evidence that in that case you are un-American because you're defending that person. And you lock into the system of a dreadful pointing fingers at one another, and the McCarthy period in the United States was an example of that. Fortunately, democracies have one advantage. There is an election round the corner, which in the totalitarian state of Czechoslovakia was not there. So you had to use other means, but in the case of United States, the McCarthy period lasted for about 3 years, maximum 4 years, depending on how you defined, and then it was gone. Also because there were powerful voices, there were Supreme Court judges who would get up and take the risk of being attacked as un-American and sympathizer of the communist governments elsewhere and say that we have to allow voices of dissent, and there were these very, very important individuals, and then it broke. But Czechoslovakia is an example where it gets locked in and stays over there. Let me just end. I've spoken for a very long time. I've got actually sheets of paper on other things to touch on, but I'm not going to do that. I don't know if there will be a Q&A. I may come back on some of these things through that, just by stressing once again that the examples I gave, I mean, it's not as if corruption is something that if you're determined, tomorrow it will come to an end. You need the determination. You need the determination to be, then you have to sit down and craft and design from individual incentives to laws very, very carefully. With that opens up a larger research agenda on law and economics, which is for people like me to get into borrowing and try to deepen our understanding of that. But that is the agenda ahead of us. One more thing, let me just say, since I did mention human mindsets, a lot of it is also to do with mindsets. Everything in life is not just rationality and trying to do better. The number of things in life that we do simply because we want to be decent human beings. We do not want to behave in certain ways because that's ordinary decency requires us to behave in certain ways. That plays a very big role. What is considered decent, what is not considered, what is considered indecent, these things can change in society. But you can get into a mindset where you think that, look, these kinds of behaviors, bribery, taking bribes, giving bribes, these are dreadful things we do not want to do. Or it can be that this is common. Everyone does it and I will do. India, there is that problem. There are lots of good people with whom the problem is everyone is doing it. How do I survive? I have to do the same. But mindsets can go into these switches and changes. And we've seen in India certain mindsets which I would never expect to change have changed. One example is smoking in public place in an auditorium. When it started in the United States that you should not smoke in an auditorium, and people soon stopped smoking because other people have to inhale your secondary smoke. I thought in India you will never get this. We are too anarchic and individualistic, so it won't happen. But it's happened in India. Even if you're a smoker, you wait to go out, step out, and then smoke instead of smoking with other people. It's become a norm and a custom. You are holding back your self-interest because a certain thing is a norm. There are changes in the human mindset which can make a huge difference to how a society functions and does well. But for that, you do need to speak up. You do need research also to point out that these are the directions in which we want to go. These are the values that we want to inculcate. And that then begins to play a role in creating a society where corruption can drop very rapidly. And the examples of UK, Sweden, Hong Kong, Singapore also tells you that when corruption drops rapidly, growth can pick up in an enormous way in countries and you can become much better. I should just conclude by saying that we are at a stage in India where there is a churning going on in human thought. For me, one of the most important cherished values is tolerance. We are a society which had a history of caste and still has a huge practice of caste, religious discrimination. We ought not to allow for that. This is a country which should create space for tolerance, for acceptance. And since we are speaking about, in memory of Palkhivala, the Parsis are a small group that came into India, into an open India, and made a huge contribution to the country. India is proud in the world by these, and we really have to cherish, nurture, and this I would appeal to our leaders, political leaders, that let us not give up on these values. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.